With the conclusion of the North American International Championships, we are officially in the first offseason in a very long time where we actually have a multi-month period of no championship point awarding events. That means there's no local league challenges, no local cups, nothing like that. We have to wait until September for next season to begin. Up until September, all that we have left is the World Championships. So if you didn't qualify, there's really not much to play for right now. But just like any competitive sport or game out there, the off season doesn't mean that we should just sit here and do nothing. It means that we should actually use this time to train, to set our goals, and to figure out what it is that we want to accomplish for next year. The best way to do that, in my opinion, is to play a bunch of different decks. I think during the competitive season, you really should lock in on the decks that you're like focused on, figuring out the matchups, all that kind of stuff. But I think during this off-season period, it's a good idea to kind of just get an idea of a lot of the best decks out there, how they function, how they work, try different decks that you might not test out, you know, at an actual cup or challenge because you're trying to get points. Try those decks out now and figure out what might be fun, what has potential, what might actually be good moving forward. So for today's video, I want to kind of briefly give my thoughts on 5 of the best decks out there to learn during this off-season. These are going to be decks that are maybe harder to learn and take more time, decks that have potential with upcoming sets, decks that actually have a competitive future in this format, and you know, potentially formats past the Pitch Black set as well. So I think these are going to be decks that are just worth investing time in right now during this off-season period. And when deciding on these decks, I've kind of looked at like how they've performed, you know, historically, also how they're kind of doing in Japan right now, and kind of what that future outlook looks like. Obviously, we don't have Pitch Black just yet, but it is coming pretty soon. So we'll get kind of more of an idea once the World Championships hit, and we'll kind of get to see the metagame for that as well. But just kind of going into that format, these are 5 decks that I think are worth investing the time in right now to figure out if it's an actual serious deck that you want to play moving forward once September hits. So first up, we have the honorable mention, Dragapult. The reason why this is an honorable mention is because, in my opinion, this is a given. Dragapult is the best deck in the format. It's going to continue to be the best deck in the format. Obviously, if you want to play Dragapult, it is worth your time investing into this and learning the deck. It's just one of those polarizing decks where some people just refuse to play it because it is the best deck in the format. Other people don't care, they just want to play the best deck in the format. So I have this listed as an honorable mention solely for the fact that it's kind of a given, like it's the best deck in the format. Obviously, it's worth learning if you want to, but I understand if you don't. So yes, if you want to learn Dragapult, I highly recommend. If you're new to the game and you want to play a deck and you don't hate Dragapult, I highly recommend you play this deck. It will continue to be the best deck, so it's definitely worth your time investing into it. But past that, let's go ahead and talk about my favorite new deck coming out, the Hide and Sneak deck here, formerly known as the Ghost Veil deck before the name changed in the US. This deck will be coming out in the Pitch Black format. We also have the Delmise in the pre-release kits once pre-releases start in a couple of weeks. And essentially, this is a single prize deck. We have a lot of single prize decks in the format right now. We have things like Team Rocket's Honchkrow, things like Barbarical with Okidogi. So we have a lot of these single prize decks where the goal is to just kind of hit the opponents, take prize cards, and you kind of keep that one prize board state. And a lot of times you're able to kind of win games off of that because you just kind of have a more favorable like prize trade essentially. The problem with some of those decks is that they just straight up lose to Dragapult. Dragapult has ways to kind of deal with those decks, and with this new Hide and Sneak deck, it's kind of the opposite. Like, it has a lot of ways to deal with Dragapult specifically, and right now in Japan it is doing pretty well. If you look at Japanese tier lists, this is like a top 2 or 3 deck. It did recently place 2nd at the Japan Championships as well, so far it has been doing very well in Japan, and there's kind of a lot of reasons for that in my opinion. So first things first, the main attacker of this deck, and the attacker you're going to be using most of the time throughout the game, is going to be the Delmise here with 140 HP. It's got the Vengeful Anchor attack, which does 30 plus 140 more if you have 4 or more Hide and Sneak Pokemon in your discard pile. So essentially the goal here is to get at least 4 Hide and Sneak Pokemon in the discard pile as soon as possible, and then we can start swinging for Delmise for 170 damage. Our other 2 attackers that we kind of use in this deck are going to be the Sinistra. This is a good Pokemon to help close out games because it has Matcha Spin, which allows you to place 4 damage counters on each of your opponent's Pokemon. So basically every Pokemon on your opponent's side takes 40 damage. When you combine that with the 170 for the Delmise, that hits for 210 essentially, which is enough to knock out a lot of Pokemon in the format, you know, Pheasantipity, Teal Mask Ogerpon, all that kind of stuff. And since Matcha Spin is placing the damage, not doing the damage, it will actually hit Terra Pokemon on the bench as well. So essentially the combination of those 2 attacks means that we can do 210 to some of those, you know, basic EX Pokemon that have that amount of HP. So it's very, very nice. you know, Dhelmise hitting for 170 is a nice number 2 because it can knock out things like Meowth EX, so very powerful with that as well. And then we also have the Banette here. This is a good kind of early game attacker and kind of a good counter to things like Unfair Stamp. It does have the Puppet Pool attack here, which does 80 damage, so not a whole lot, but still enough to knock out things like Dreepy. And you are able to search your deck for any card that you want and put it into your hand, so very strong effect with that. And then obviously the Hide and Sneak Pokemon with that ability, they are protected from effects of attacks or abilities from your opponent's Pokemon. That means that Dragapult cannot place damage counters on the bench. It means that Pokemon like Munkidori cannot move damage to these Pokemon. Things like Dusknoir cannot pop their ability on these Pokemon. They're safe from all that stuff. So basically that ability protects them from all those things. And again, compared to other single prize decks out there, that's kind of the problem, you know what I mean? You have these like low HP single prizers, things like Zoroark and Lunatone, where Dragapult can kind of place that damage and then, you know, clean up those turns later on. They're not really able to do that with this deck. They can really only put that damage onto things like Dhelmise here, which are pretty beefy, I would say, 140 HP. So they kind of need a lot to be able to knock those out on the bench. We also have some good support options with this deck as well. So we have Gwen here, a new supporter coming out with Pitch Black. We get to discard up to 2 Pokemon from our hand, which works pretty well with the Hide and Sneak Pokemon. We can just go ahead and discard them, and then we get to draw 3 cards for each Pokemon discarded in that way. So essentially, if we get rid of 2 Pokemon here, we are drawing 6 cards, which is obviously very, very good, very strong. We've also got Prism Tower as the stadium of choice here. So we have to discard 2 cards from our hand, and then we get to draw a card. So same thing. The ability to just discard Pokemon. We have multiple ways to do it now, multiple ways to get those Pokemon into the discard pile pretty early on. And then of course we have the Telepathic Energy here, so you attach that to a Psychic type Pokemon and you can bench 2 basic Psychic Pokemon directly onto your bench. So just really good setup. You know, you put that on a Dhelmise, you can put down 2 more Pokemon on your bench. Very, very strong, obviously, in just getting set up. Telepathic Energy is just one of the best energies out there. We've seen that with all the Psychic decks. It's just a really, really strong energy card out there. So this right here is the 2nd place list from the Japan Championships. Essentially, with all of these Hide and Sneak decks, we are seeing that the Dunsparce engine being used with the Runaway Draw ability. So essentially, you get to draw 3 cards and then shuffle the Dunsparce back into the deck. So just a really good draw supporter for a deck like this. This deck is also running the Pat Rat here, just kind of that additional support to not allow our opponent to use Munkidori. Essentially, its ability prevents them from moving damage onto your side of the board. So even though our Hide and Sneak Pokemon are safe from things like Munkidori, it's kind of there to protect things like Dunsparce or even the Dhelmise, to kind of prevent those big knockout turns later on. So it is kind of weak to Watchtower, which kind of sucks, but that's okay. It's still a good option to have, especially against decks that don't really play Watchtower. We've also got the Legacy Energy here as the A spec of choice. It counts as every type of energy, and if your opponent knocks out the Pokemon with Legacy Energy attached from an attack with damage, then essentially they do not get to take a prize card. So even further kind of leaning into that prize trade favorability here. So kind of saying, hey, you need to take 7 knockouts to win the game, not 6, which is very good against a lot of decks that have no way to deal with it. And it's really good against things like, you know, matchups into these other single prize decks. When you think about like a Team Rocket's Honchkrow, for example, you know, they essentially can only take knockouts by hitting whatever's in front of them. So eventually they're going to have to hit that Legacy Energy if you bench correctly. And you're going to basically win that prize trade every single time. So it's a really good card, especially in those matchups against other single prize decks, I feel like. And then we also have the Blood Moon Ursaluna here, which is a good way to close out games, just to do some extra damage. Just because 170 is usually not enough for like big knockouts. Blood Moon is kind of there to kind of clean up the games as well. So very good for that. But overall, really solid list here. I really like a lot of the things with the list here, and I'm very excited to experiment with this deck. But I think this is a really good deck to go ahead and learn. That's pretty simple, I'd say, for the most part. Like, you know what you want to do. You want to hit with Dhelmise, you want to draw cards, and you want to close out the game with Sinistra most of the time if you need that extra damage. And it's just a really good single prize deck to learn. I'd say this is probably going to be the best single prize deck moving forward based on what we've seen so far in Japan. And we do have the Lily's Clefairy as well, so that we're able to one-shot Dragapult, because Dhelmise now hits for weakness. So 170 times 2 is going to be, what, 340? So you're one-shotting Dragapult with a single prizer, which is obviously very, very good. So yeah, it's got a good Dragapult matchup, and that's kind of what you need to be viable, I feel like. So I think this is a really good deck to invest in over the summer once it releases. The next deck I want to talk about here is Zoroark, another deck that's really worth learning, I'd say, if you like this type of deck. I'd say out of all the decks that we're talking about today, this one is going to be the hardest to learn. Lots of layers to it. There's a reason why you see pretty much only top players do well with this deck, like at majors. It's a very kind of interesting deck. It's a deck that you have to like enjoy, I would say. There's a lot that you can do with it. There's really no like one set way to play the deck. We've seen all different types of lists with this deck, and it's just a deck that takes a lot of time. So I'd say, you know, go ahead and test this out, see if it's kind of your style, if you enjoy it, and if you like the concept of it. I think there's a lot of resources out there to get better with this deck. It definitely takes time to learn, though, to actually pilot pretty well. So it does have the trade ability here. You get to discard a card from your hand and draw 2 cards. So obviously a very, very strong draw engine here. Probably the second strongest one behind Recon Directive, I would say. And with this deck, every single list pretty much plays the End Zekrom here, which does 250 damage. Obviously you can copy that with Night Joker, so you're swinging for 250. All these decks play Monkey Dory, some play 1, some play 2, some might even play 3, just to be able to move damage from your side of the board onto your opponent's side. So essentially you're hitting for 250, and we have ways to kind of do more damage with Monkey Dory, with things like Binding Mochi, Black Belt's Training. So essentially those cards help us get those one-shots on those bigger Pokemon. The revelation here, though, that we saw at NAIC was the Transformation Tome. You get to play 2 of these, or you have to play 2 of these for it to actually have an effect. If you play 2 of these, you get to choose a basic Pokemon from your discard pile and switch it with one of your basics in play. So essentially what this does is it allows you to kind of clean up your board, which was a big problem for Zoroark in the past. You know, our board is kind of clogged up with things like Meowth on here, with things like Pecharunt, Badoo, Tatsugiri, things that we want to kind of get rid of. And Transformation Tome allows us to do that. And with some of these evolving Pokemon that we saw in this list here specifically, this was the 10th place NAIC list here. With some of these evolving Pokemon, a lot of times your opponent can see it coming from a mile away. They can see that you bench the Darumaka and you're going to evolve it into Darmanitan, and then you're going to go for Flame Body Cannon with copying it from, you know, Night Joker. And so essentially what this does is it allows you to go for these big kind of pop-off turns or these big surprise plays, because you're able to switch this, you know, Darumaka that's in your discard pile with a Pokemon that's currently in play. And if it's been in play for more than 1 turn, you can evolve it that same exact turn, and you can essentially just go for those big plays all in 1 turn out of nowhere. So if we have a Badoo sitting on our bench for multiple turns on end, we can play Transformation Tome, swap it out with Darumaka, evolve it instantly, and now we can go for Flame Body Cannon. That's kind of a surprise attack. So essentially what it does is it allows you to go for those big plays. You got the Drapion here as well with the Hazardous Tail. This is really good against those decks that we have really bad matchups into, like Hydrapple. You can now paralyze it, you can now do damage to yourself and move it with Monkey Dory, so really good attack there as well. It is obviously harder to set up, it costs 3 energy, but keep in mind, if we power up an End Zoroark with the Ends PP up and stuff like that, we're able to use Transformation Tome, and all of those attached cards transfer over to the new Pokemon in play. So again, we can instantly power it up. We can still use cards like Ends PP up to use those effects and get those energies on the board, and then swap it out with something like a Drapion. So there's a lot of really cool things you can do with this deck. It does have bad grass matchups, obviously, but it's good into a lot of other things. And just like the Hide and Seek deck, it has a really good Dragapult matchup, I would say. It's probably the best Dragapult matchup. It just kind of shuts down Dragapult. It just loses to a lot of random things out there. So I think that there are ways to kind of build the deck to deal with those random things. You know, you have things like Yveltal, you have Darmanitan to take multiple prizes. So there's ways to still beat those decks. It's just a lot harder, I would say. But this is a very unique deck. This is a deck where if you enjoy deck building and you enjoy trying out all different types of lists and stuff like that, you're going to really like End Zoroark, I feel like. Now after that we have Festival Lead, which has actually been doing very well in Japan as well. It's kind of moved its way back up into like a top 4, top 5 kind of deck. Another single prize deck out there, and it does get a pretty big buff with Pitch Black, which you might not realize right away until you actually see all the cards in the set list. But essentially with this one, we've got the Festival Lead ability here. So if the Festival Ground Stadium is in play, we get to essentially attack twice with Do the Wave, doing 20 damage for each of our bench Pokemon. We're essentially hitting for 100 every turn, and if we get to attack twice, we're hitting for 200. We do have ways to modify that damage, which I will get to. But the other big part of this deck is the Thwackey here with the Boom Boom Groove ability. So once during our turn, as long as we have a Festival Elite Pokemon in the active spot, we get to search our deck for any card that we want. You can play multiple Thwackey, which means that you can search for multiple cards that you want. Very strong ability, obviously, and Diplin being a very strong attacker, especially with us being able to modify our attacks for more damage. We also have this Grookey, which just recently came out, which I will talk about in just a second, but this is an optimal Grookey. At first, I didn't realize why, but then I looked at it more and I was like, okay, that actually makes sense. So we will get to that in just a second, but let's talk about our damage modifiers here. So the big new support card coming out is this new Gladion here. During our turn, attacks used by our Pokemon that don't have a rule box, so Diplin for example, will do 80 more damage to our opponent's active Pokemon. We can only use this card if it's the only remaining card in our hand. It's not really a problem though. We can kind of freely discard things because we do have Thwackey on our bench, which means that if we play Gladion, we have no more cards in our hand. It means that next turn we can use Thwackey to basically find whatever it is that we want. So as long as we can kind of clear out our hand and be able to use that card, it's really not a problem because we can use Thwackey to get whatever we want next turn. We're able to do 80 more damage, which means that Diplin is now doing 180 damage times 2 because it's going to attack twice. You attach a Brave Bengal on top of that, it does an extra 30 damage on top of that. So that essentially means that if we play Gladion and Brave Bengal, we're hitting for 210 twice. So essentially we're hitting for 210, they push something else up, we're hitting for 210 again. So we can take multiple one-shots on a lot of Pokemon in the format. Very, very strong. Gladion makes us do way more damage. It's a very powerful card for this deck specifically because we are able to attack twice. Most of these lists that I've seen are still playing the Kirin because we do want to have that switch effect in case, you know, they try to get our Thwackey stuck in the active. We're able to use Kirin to switch out, and it's also a damage modifier as well because again, Gladion, you have to clear out your hand. You can't have anything else in your hand, so Kirin doesn't have any effect like that or any kind of, you know, I guess requirement like that, I should say. This right here is a top 16 list from the Japan Championships. Pretty standard here. They are using the other type of Applin, the Dragon type, which is interesting. They are kind of moving away from bug catching set because they decided to use the growing energy, which gives us 20 more HP. So, you know, different types of inclusions there from what we typically see with Festival Lead, but I have seen a lot of lists in Japan kind of running a similar style to this as well. And the other thing I wanted to mention quickly was the Grookey, the reason why it's more optimal. So it does hit for 40 damage. Previously, Grookey's hit for I think 20 and 10 or 30 damage. I know none of them in the format right now hit for 40, but the reason why this one is optimal is because it deals with things like the Cornerstone Ogerpon, which has 210 HP. It's also weak to grass, and it's not affected by... You can't hit it with Pokemon that have abilities. So essentially, Grookey does not have an ability, so 40 damage plus something like a Gladion means that you can one-shot things like Cornerstone Ogerpon. So that's essentially all it is. It's just an answer to Cornerstone. So still worth it to probably have one of these in your deck if you're able to get your hands on it. But yeah, this is a pretty standard Festival Lead list right here. Like I said, some differences as far as the Applins of choice. Getting rid of the bug catching sets instead of running 4, just running 2, and then running the growing energies instead. Secret box, obviously the ace spec of choice here to be able to find exactly what you need. You can also use that to discard cards. That way you can use things like Gladion. So very strong deck here. Very good single prize deck, and it's moving back up in the tier list. Right now it's kind of at a low because of Dragon Pults, but with the new Gladion, it gets a lot stronger. So definitely worth learning in my opinion. Our fourth deck on the list here is another new deck, and this is the Mega Excadrill deck. It did not do super well in the Japan Championships, but it has been doing well overall in Japan and still seems to be a contender for the most part. When it first came out, it was like kind of top of the tier list. It's moved down a little bit since then, but still kind of up there as far as like a viable deck goes. This is a Mega Pokemon worth 3 prize cards, 340 HP on this thing. And you're going to mostly be using maximum drilling, which does 200 damage, and if there's at least 2 extra energies, so 5 metal energy in total, you're doing 130 extra damage. you're essentially hitting for 330, which is enough to one-shot just about anything out there. It does also have the Undermine attack here for 90 damage, and you can discard the top 2 cards of your opponent's deck, so still a pretty strong effect. You're able to one-shot things like Dracloak and also discard a couple of cards, which is always good. So 2 very strong attacks in my opinion. It's very beefy, it's 340 HP, it's really only weak to fire, so there are things like Moltres, which don't one-shot it, but still do a lot of damage, so that is one thing to kind of watch out for here. But essentially, this deck works because we play it with the Matang from Temporal Forces, with the Metal Maker ability, so every single turn, you get to look at the top 4 cards of your deck and attach any number of basic metal energy you find there to your Pokemon. You can use this ability, like if you have multiple Matangs, you can use it multiple times, so if I have 3 Matangs, I can use Metal Maker 3 times during my turn, 1 for each Matang, obviously. And this is a really good deck in my opinion to just kind of get better at sequencing, just kind of figuring out like where cards are in your deck. You know, when you play certain cards, you go Metal Maker, you get to look at 4 cards. If they're not metal energies, you now know that those 4 specific cards are on the bottom of your deck. And so you have to kind of make those decisions of, do I want to shuffle the deck and play something like an Ultra Ball? Do I want to keep my deck in the order that it is and keep going for Metal Makers? I think it's a really good deck for that, just kind of figuring out sequencing and figuring out how to kind of do that within a deck. This is probably the best way to do it, is with a deck that plays a card like Matang, where you're able to look at cards, put them at the bottom of your deck, and kind of figure out like where they are by looking at them essentially. This deck also does have the Metagross here, the single prize attacker, which is played in Slowking, but in this deck we actually use Metagross to attack with sometimes. You get to do 300 damage, so kind of similar to Excadrill, except that it's on a single prize Pokemon, so kind of a good way to offset the prize card race if you're able to do that. So just another strong attacker that we can evolve out of Metang. This deck does play Precious Trolley. It plays, I think, 4 Petrol, 4 Team Rocket's Transceiver to find the Petrol, so you kind of want to get Precious Trolley down turn 1. If you're not able to do that, you're going to have a bad time. It also plays Jumbo Ice Cream because, again, Excadrill is very bulky. We get to heal damage. We also have the Energy Recycler here to be able to shuffle energies back into our deck. So it's just a great way to kind of get energies back into the deck and be able to find those energies off of a Metal Maker. And yeah, that's kind of the goal of this deck, you know, just hit with Excadrill, knock out anything in front of you, and survive attacks with Jumbo Ice Cream. That's kind of how this deck functions. So sorry for their blurriness here. I don't know why it's blurry, but this right here is a list that I believe won like a city tournament or something like that in Japan. It's pretty similar to a lot of lists that I've seen though, so pretty straightforward. We're attacking mostly with Excadrill. We have the Matangs, we have the Metagrosses, we have Genesect EX, which allows it to find 2 evolution metal Pokemon and put them into our hands. So that's kind of how we get set up. We got the Trolley to get everything out there, and yeah, it's a pretty straightforward deck. I think this deck is a good deck to learn because it is going to be viable, I think. And I also think it's a great way to kind of learn sequencing, which can help with other decks like Dragapult, for example. So I think for those 2 reasons, it's definitely worth learning. And also because it's a new deck and new decks are fun. So just go ahead and give it a shot and see if you like it. And the last deck we want to talk about here is Alakazam. Now, in the past, I've been an Alakazam hater, but I do think that this is still a very strong deck. And I think with how it's being played right now, it does have a viable Dragapult matchup. The one downside to Alakazam, or the one major downside I should say, is that there are certain matchups you're going to run into where you just kind of auto lose, and that's because your only attacker in this deck is Alakazam, which places damage counters instead of doing damage, which means that Pokemon that aren't affected by effects of attacks like placing damage, they're essentially immune to this deck. Like if you run into a Team Rocket's Articuno, you really have no great way to win that matchup. Even if we look back at the very beginning of this video and we look at the new Hide and Sneak deck, if I'm playing this deck and I run up into Alakazam, I'm not benching Delmise. I'm just going to play the Hide and Sneak Pokemon, which cannot be affected by effects of attacks, which means that they are essentially immune to Alakazam. It's kind of just an auto win, right? So essentially with Pitch Black, we're adding another deck that has an auto win matchup into Alakazam. So because of that, it's not a great play into that, but I think outside of those bad matchups, Alakazam is like one of the best decks out there. Like it's a very strong deck. It's just being held back a little bit by the fact that there are certain decks out there that just kind of auto win against this. So it's kind of the same problem as Zoroark, where you're good into like the best stuff in the format, but you just kind of lose to these random different things. So it's kind of just a little bit of matchup roulette as far as what you hit. But essentially with this deck, what it does is you draw a bunch of cards, you do more damage for the amount of cards in your hand, As we evolve up into Alakazam, we get to draw more cards. We played a Dunsparce to be able to draw more cards. With the most recent builds of Alakazam, they are playing cards like LGM here, kind of as a control kind of option to kind of disrupt our opponents. So this card does have the attack slight shift, where we get to move an energy from one of our opponent's Pokemon to another one of the Pokemon. So you can move energies onto a thing like a Badoo, something useless where they don't get to actually use those energies. So kind of a good way to disrupt your opponents. Obviously, the most popular build recently is again this kind of control version, which plays things like Nighttime Mind to deal with Dragapult, Handheld Fan to just move energies around and disrupt. Things like the Dene to recycle cards in our deck, like Enhanced Hammer to get rid of special energies. So this right here is obviously the first place list that won the Indianapolis regionals. And again, it's a very interesting build of Alakazam that I think actually does have a decent Dragapult matchup. You play the Nighttime Mind, you play the Handheld Fans, you play the LGM, essentially saying that we're going to mess with your energies and we're going to kind of force you to not be able to attack. So I think it's a very strong way to kind of build this deck around beating Dragapult, because it kind of naturally beats everything else that's not an auto loss, I would say. You're beating the other single prize decks, you're beating, you know, all the big, you know, 2 prize decks like you know, the Clefairy, Kangaskhan decks. You're kind of beating all those decks naturally. So really the biggest problem for this deck is Dragapult, which this version of the deck kind of beats. And then aside from that, we do have our auto loss matchups, which there's not a whole lot you can do about that. So I think it's a really good deck to kind of just learn how to manage your cards. You're drawing a bunch of cards, you're looking at a bunch of cards, you got to kind of figure out like, hey, like how do I play my hand here? What do I want to use up? I think it's a really good deck just to kind of help learn the game a little bit more and just kind of learn when to make certain decisions. It's a deck where if you lose a game, you can kind of look back and say, okay, I did this incorrectly. How can I fix this for next time? I think it's a really good deck for that. And that's kind of where I'm at right now. These are 5 decks that I think are really worth investing the time into. Again, the honorable mention here is Dragapult. Dragapult's obviously worth it to learn. If you're okay with learning Dragapult, that's like number 1 on the list, but that's kind of a given, so that's why I'm not talking about it. Aside from Dragapult though, these are 5 decks that I would highly recommend learning this summer in the off season to kind of figure out, you know, what it is that you want to play moving forward in the competitive season. I think when September hits, we'll still be in that pitch black format. I know that 30th anniversary set hits around then, so that's going to get added, but that shouldn't add too much to the meta. I think what we kind of see going into World is going to be kind of what we're going to see at the beginning of next season. So it's a good time to learn new decks. It's a good time to figure out what it is that you like, and these are the 5 best decks in my opinion to do that with, aside from Dragapult. But go ahead and let me know in the comments what you guys think, if this is helpful at all. If you like these types of videos where I just kind of talk about the competitive field out there in general and kind of give out my ideas on decks and stuff like that, you guys can let me know in the comments if you enjoy that. I'd appreciate it if you subscribe to the channel. It helps out a lot. Thank you guys for watching, and I hope you guys have a good one.